Thanks very much, Chris. So you might already know the co-authored work of the philosopher Pierre Dardot, based at Nanterre, and Christian Laval, a sociologist at the same institution. Their influential critical and historical account of neoliberal capitalism has been translated into English in 2013 as The New Way of the World, as is their critique of a specifically neoliberal form of rule, which they call governance, after Wendy Brown, essentially a form of political management which excludes radically democratic politics, translated as the never-ending nightmare subsequently. Although neither they nor Brown often refer to the work of Jacques Rancière, I've argued recently in a piece for a New Formation special issue on bureaucracy that this conception of governance owes much to his elaboration of the concept of the police order some 2 decades earlier. But today I want to give an account of just one book, published some 3 months ago and entitled Dominer, Enquête sur la souveraineté de l'État en Occident, published by La Découverte. And it runs to over 700 pages. And to consider the book for a moment very reductively in its material reality, it really is what the French call un pavé, a big fat paving slab of a book. More incisively, I would say that it's in its own way a colossal scholarly achievement, and that I'm only going to be able to scratch its surface today, but scratch I shall, for I think that there's also much with which we need to take issue. Although nominally co-authored, as they make clear in the introduction, the book is primarily the work of Dardot and is to be followed up shortly with a second volume by Laval, reflecting strategically on the implications of the first volume's primarily historical analysis for the future of left-wing political movements today. But in the paper today, I'm going to treat it as a co-authored volume, as it's presented. In situating their study, they gesture to Putin, Trump, Bolsonaro, Modi, Erdogan, Netanyahu, to whom I'd also want to add Johnson, bin Salman, and Orban, among others, some of whom were already mentioned by Nick, to show that we're in the midst of a resurgence of nation-state sovereigntism of a virulently populist form. The book's central claim is that state sovereignty has a long history and certainly hasn't gone away. That such nationalist populist leaders could win power in an era of neoliberal globalization may seem to be a paradox, because this form of politico-economic rationality appears to weaken the power of the nation state by subjugating its autonomous decision-making authority to international norms and standards, above all by subjugating every area of social value to economic worth. But in fact, neoliberal capitalism depends, they argue, on a strong nation state. They aim in particular to show that the notion heard today on the right and the left and alike, that the correct response to the ill effects of globalization is to bolster or restore the power of the nation state, is a grave political error. The pernicious effects of reinvigorated nation state sovereigntism are evident, they claim, in the world's ongoing inability to tackle international challenges. I use this favored euphemism of neoliberal language advisedly in scare quotes, challenges such as climate change, and no doubt we should also add to this the breaching of other global boundaries discussed by Graham in his paper yesterday. They assemble Dardot and Laval, they describe Dardot and Laval their study as a genealogy in the Foucauldian sense of the legal fiction of a subject called a state as a public personage equipped with a sovereign will. Whether it is really a genealogy in the Foucauldian sense is a question that I'm going to return to later, but for now I want to note that despite its express methodological debt to Foucault, the book is also explicitly presented as a refutation of key facets of Foucault's analysis of sovereign power, and indeed of the way in which sovereign power is related to other forms of power which Foucault named, explored, and typologized, and renamed, re-explored, and re-typologized. So intricate is the relationship of indebtedness and differentiation to Foucault's work that the book includes a single appendix of some 20 pages that I speculate may have been added at the request of the publisher or their readers to try to clarify precisely what is owed to or disputed in Foucault's approach to sovereignty. I'm going to return to give my own verdict on those questions, which I think are very vexed at the end of the paper. But first, I want to summarize some of the key points in the book's main argument. They begin by noting that historical anthropology has shown the state to be a relatively recent invention in human history. Drawing on the work of Pierre and his student James Scott, they note that the first states only appeared as late as 3100 BCE in the valley of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and that the state form only became irreversibly hegemonic in Europe around 1600. They also echo Alain Testar's speculation that in pre-Christian Europe of the second and first millennia BCE, the custom of popular assembly, which made decisions without constituting a state or exercising sovereignty, was a key factor in resisting the importation of the state form from the Middle East. Indeed, they exert a great deal of argumentative energy in the early part of the book, trying to show that while the exercise of political power of command that they call supremacy was of course a feature of pre-Christian Europe as well as of ancient Greece and Rome, such supremacy, brutal though it sometimes was, must be distinguished from sovereignty. Similarly, they denied to the ancient Greeks and Romans the dubious dignity of statehood. These cultures had no states, they say, in the sense that they lacked a unitary political center detached from the surrounding society, which also served as the supreme subject of legal decision-making. They go to similar lengths in insisting on a differentiation between the feudal concept of suzerainty and the modern concept of sovereignty. And as you may have gathered from the way that I have been describing their way of proceeding, I find these argumentative exertions somewhat strained and at times almost tautologous. Nevertheless, the concept of sovereignty was elaborated, they argue, and the modern sovereign state developed between the 11th and the 16th centuries. Following legal historian Harold Berman, in particular the first part of his book Law and Revolution from 1983, they assert that the foundational move was the claim by Pope Gregory VII in his papal Dictatus of 1075 of political and judicial sovereignty of the papacy over the church, and of the clergy's independence from temporal power, and indeed the sovereignty of the Pope over all matters temporal that he then delegated to temporal rulers. This was a revolutionary act in the sense that it constituted a self-attribution of political power by the papacy, unprecedented in canon law, but subsequently very much elaborated in the body of canon law. Nascent European states essentially imitated, they also say appropriated, borrowed the model of this papal revolution in self-declaring and juridico-politically constituting their own sovereignty and statehood. The key distinction between feudal suzerainty and monarchical sovereignty, they argue, after Kantorowicz, in his essay in particular on the so-called mysteries of state, was the sacralization of monarchical power, the development of mysticism and ritual in parallel with the more mundane juridico-political and administrative elaborations between the end of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance of concepts such as the crown, not the TV series, of course, to denote the property and privileges of the state as distinct from the private wealth of the sovereign, alongside which the development of systems of taxation and institutions such as the royal or state treasury. Now, at this point in the chronology, the book's focus narrows down quite considerably to France, where it remains for several hundred further pages, although there are brief forays also into English and German society and ideas, before at the very end, with the advent of neoliberalism, the focus suddenly zooms out again to embrace, at least in theory, the entire globe. In this French section, no significant jurist, political philosopher, administrative reformer, or movement is neglected. Not just Baudin, of course, whose argument for direct monarchical absolutism, which dispensed with corporate and other lesser interests, was revived by theoreticians of royal absolutism and la raison d'etat in the 17th century, but also somewhat less well-known figures from the early modern period, Charles Loiseau and Jean Dominer in particular. What is striking, however, is the primarily juridico-political tenor of the inquiry. When historical reality does intrude, it does so all too briefly in a rather abrupt and disarming way. Writing about France in the 17th century, for example, they assert that despite the revival of Baudin's doctrine, royal absolutism was largely theoretical, and resistance to centralist monarchical authority was intense and diverse. And of course, the Westphalian state system gets a mention too. They note, not originally, they note that its ideal of sovereign states counterpoised with one another in a so-called balance of power implied a competitive strengthening of state sovereignty, both externally and internally, in other words, of war and of police power in conjunction. When Dardot and Laval's chronology reaches the 18th century, and especially the physiocrats, something rather strange happens. They say explicitly that they want to repudiate Foucault's assertion of a rupture in sovereign power at this point, or specifically of a rupture between mercantilism and physiocracy. They want to assert instead the continuity and the rearticulation of sovereign power within governmentality at this critical juncture. The juncture is critical for their argument because it presages the development of liberal capitalism and by extension, neoliberal capitalism. So it's decisive not only for the accuracy, but also for the political pertinence today of their historical study, at least in the way they try and situate it. At this critical juncture, the divergence from Foucault is pronounced. They assert that Foucault, in his examination of physiocracy as a precursor of liberal capitalism, seriously underestimated the role played by sovereignty, or what some physiocrats called monarchical or legal despotism. While it's true that the physiocrats believed in royal absolutism of a sort, they very explicitly subordinated this form of sovereignty to the law of nature. The ideal monarch envisaged by the physiocrats was certainly an absolute ruler, but was also a scientifically informed technocrat. By introducing an independent standard of judgment, the law of nature, which in early liberal capitalism would become Adam Smith's invisible hand, the physiocrats and their immediate successors unquestionably curtailed the scope and mystery of royal sovereignty by subordinating it to what would ultimately be known as economic factors. When it comes to Smith and Bentham, Dardot and Laval are particularly emphatic about the alleged continuance or continuity of sovereignty, and noting in particular Bentham's appreciation for the so-called habit of obedience in citizen subjects. I'm racing through here, but when they arrive at the French Revolution, and in particular the influence of Rousseau's conception of popular sovereignty, this study begins to show its true, and I would say profoundly Tocquevillian colours. They acknowledge that Rousseau's conception was radically novel insofar as it made the people the only source of sovereignty. And so in that sense, it systematically reversed all of Baudin's key precepts on sovereign power. Considering the revolution, they cite approvingly the Tocquevillian jurist and legal historian beloved of Charles de Gaulle, Raymond Carré de Marberg, who argued that the revolution essentially carried over the sovereigntist statism of the Ancien Régime, in particular in its affirmation that the Republic was one and indivisible. Sovereignty was simply transferred from the monarch to the nation, and to the extent that the monarch was retained, this was as first functionary, premier fonctionnaire of the sovereign nation. And of course, the king's reluctance to play that role caused some problems. At the revolution, they say, le changement semble radical, the change seemed radical. And in that sense, their study is profoundly Tocquevillian and resonates with other studies of the long history of the modern French state, notably by the revisionist revolutionary historian Denis Richet. Along with Furet, Richet was a prominent member of a group of neo-Tocquevillian revisionist historians who were arguing from the early 1970s, to summarize Rancière's critique of their historiographical practice, that the French Revolution was a non-event, the culmination of centuries of state-making, rather than a foundational event with political consequences for the future. For historians of the French Revolution's administrative reforms, Dardot and Laval's remarks on the generalization of surveillance as a transmogrified form of sovereignty immanent within society will seem, I think, rather lacking in technical and practical detail. And it seems to me that the limitations of an approach which is primarily juridico-political, primarily focused on the history of political ideas, as opposed to practices, embodied and lived social reality, is particularly apparent in their treatment of the revolution, when ideas and principles get all mangled up with practical constraints and expediency. In the aftermath of the revolution, Dardot and Laval argue that the early French socialists, in particular Saint-Simon, tried to question the principle of sovereignty and to substitute for it the principle of association, and to replace sovereign command with a steering, management, or direction of autonomous productive forces immanent within society. I'm very struck, however, by how partial a reading of Saint-Simon they offer, one notably from which his insistence on the need for an authoritarian police to round up and punish the work-shy is absent, and a reading which also ignores the way in which Saint-Simonianism prefigured, I would argue, neoliberal governance's technocratic management of productive forces without politics. They focus instead on the upside of his vision of a society that has no need to be commanded, and they seem to take his word that the direction of productive forces could always be non-coercive. And there follows a very long chapter, chapter 10, on Marx's reading of Hegel on the state. And I'm going to skip over the detail of this, but note simply its conclusion, not an entirely original conclusion, that the late Marx of the Civil War in France repudiated the Communist Manifesto's sovereigntist and statist commitment to the dictatorship of the proletariat in preference for the Paris Commune's anti-sovereigntist and anti-statist form of socialism. And they also note, of course, that in actually existing communist states, it was the early Marxist statist sovereigntism that won out. In the relatively short concluding section on late liberal and neoliberal capitalism, they argue, and I quote, that neoliberal sovereignty presupposes the maintenance and reinforcement of state sovereignty, which provides symbolic and material support for the power of capital, if only to contain the opposition to a social and economic system that is increasingly inequitable and increasingly destructive of the environment. They are clearly thinking of contemporary France under Emmanuel Macron, Macron, the pure representative of capital, as Rancière has called him, when they cite the Gilets jaunes' characterization of the French police as a kind of militia of capital. So I said I would say a little bit more about the book's dialogue with Foucault's conception of sovereign power and about its self-characterization as a Foucauldian genealogy. And it's here that my paper will also touch lightly, I'm afraid, on the topic of our colloquium, autonomy. While I think it has many local merits, I do not believe that Dardot and Laval's overarching history, which is largely an exercise in the history of juridico-political ideas, comes anywhere close to qualifying as a genealogy in Foucault's sense of that term, adapted, of course, from Nietzsche. Certainly, it traces the history of an idea, or what it wants to claim, what it wants to claim with great determination is a single idea, but it's insufficiently attentive to the messy stuff of historical reality, particularly those complex imbrications of embodied material reality and the visceral horrors of history with the lofty parlance of political theory and the technical apparatus of juridical and institutional forms and practices. With regard to the much wider question of the divergences from Foucault on sovereign power, I've already signaled that the treatment of the physiocrats and early liberal capitalists is a key point of divergence, but one at which Foucault's argument for there being a rupture with sovereign power is, I think, more compelling than Dardot and Laval's insistence on its self-transforming continuity. I would say generally that Dardot and Laval do seem at various points to be arguing against a very periodizing reading of Foucault's typologies of power, a reading they know to be incorrect. They say it's incorrect, which in its naive form is clearly a misreading, although it's one that's still encountered today, for example, in the work of Byung-Chul Han, a reading whereby sovereign power gives way to disciplinary power and other forms of governmentality, such as biopolitics. And in some accounts, these cede in turn to post-disciplinary forms of governmentality characterized by Deleuze's concept of la société de contrôle, the control or the monitoring society. Now, it's clear from their appendix, this 20-page appendix, that Dardot and Laval are acutely aware not only of the difficulties in Foucault's repeatedly self-re-elaborating work on the typologies of power, but that they're also aware and sensitive to some of the analytical force of his approach. But their somewhat sketchy suggestion that Foucault follows Kantorowicz too closely in tying his understanding of sovereignty to the body of the king is, I think, unwarranted. And similarly, their insinuation that something mystical got in the way of an accurate analysis, something mystical drawn from the work of Georges Bataille, is to misunderstand the revolutionary character of Foucauldian historiography. Indeed, it can be seen as a kind of historiographically counter-revolutionary move, an attempt to reassert an old-fashioned Marxist state theory with its much more limited focus on the juridico-political. I'm going to conclude with a gesture towards autonomy. Foucault's approach would be better able, I think, to address the sense in which the notion of state sovereignty is allied with supporting notions such as the self-mastering, self-willing, autonomous subject, and in turn supports those notions. So Sieyès, in a passage from Qu'est-ce que le tiers-état, which they quote, wrote that in the same way that an individual must govern himself in the state of nature, must will, deliberate, and act, in the same way must a constituted nation govern itself, that is, will, deliberate, and act. In other words, the revolution's understanding of national sovereignty was bound up with the notion of a sovereign, self-mastering, self-willing, perhaps implicitly masculine, autonomous subject, in the sense in which that term had currency in the late 18th century from Kant's work in particular, but not only Kant. And this speaks, to my mind, in favor of Foucault's approach to the typologies of power, correctly interpreted, in which sovereign power is not just a narrow political and juridico-legal concept, but always also has to do with embodiment, with the family and with social life. Thus, the sovereign power of the family will be broken open and partially dismantled by the sciences over the 19th and 20th centuries, as they seek to assert their expertise over matters as diverse as child rearing and infantile masturbation. But it's clear from the psychiatric power lectures that Foucault does not think that these incursions somehow suddenly and entirely extinguish sovereignty from the family, as is apparent everywhere in the persistence today of domestic forms of tyranny. And I think I'll leave this short critical review of Dardot and Laval's book there. Thank you for your attention.